All right, knowing God's existence, lesson number 3. And tonight we're going to be talking about the evidence of ourselves. And so, as what I've mentioned the last several nights or the last several times is that, there's not a proof that God exists. If God wanted to prove his existence, he very well could. He could come and he could show himself in his glory, and it would be undeniable proof that he exists and that he is exactly who he says he is. And by the way, if he were to do that, there would still be some people who would not submit to his authority, because that's just the way that things go. But God doesn't do that. He chooses not to do that. And the reason why he chooses not to do it is because he wants people to exercise faith in knowing him. And if you think about it, exercising faith in knowing him and just believing that he exists, and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him, that is a way of giving him glory and giving him praise and honor. And so, even though there's no proof of his existence, that doesn't mean that there isn't evidence of his existence. And if you stop and think about it, if he is there, which he is, then there is going to be evidence of the fact that he's there. In fact, he's left the evidence for us. And so that's really what we're looking at. I'm not trying to prove God's existence, because that's not something to prove. What I'm doing tonight is just simply saying, hey, this is the evidence that's there, and if we choose to look at it and believe it and accept it, then we can be the beneficiaries of it. But if people want to harden their hearts and reject it, well, then, they suffer the consequences of that. So, well, as far as the evidence of ourselves go, we ourselves, as far as humanity, we are evidence of God's existence. And, it's very strong evidence of God's existence. And if you think about it, since we are made in the likeness and the image of God, then just simply we being ourselves, then we should be able to take a look at ourselves and know that there is a creator, because we have a creation. We are his creation. So starting things out in the what do you think section here, if you heard the quote-unquote smartest person in the world say something, would you believe him or her? By the way, who is the smartest person in the world? I mean, there is, I think her name is it Marilyn Van Zant? There's somebody who has the highest intellect in the world. Yeah. Oh, did she? Yeah, I'm thinking that. Well, I'm talking about now. Well, yes, but we're talking about a living person right now. So, okay, enough of that. If the smartest person in the world said something, would you believe it? Why or why not? Okay. So. Okay. So you wouldn't just simply take it on blind faith, would you? Okay.
So you trust your own reasoning above theirs?
No, not my own. I would go to other facts.
Yeah, but you have to reason through those facts. Sure. It's still your interpretation.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, you take like Paul says, you take a person that knows the whole thing, but if they have a gift of knowledge, but if they have not love, can you trust them?
Well,
true.
And at the same time, if somebody, by the way, knowledge isn't the end all to end all. I mean, somebody can have knowledge, but if they don't have the right wisdom, if they are using worldly wisdom with their knowledge, then compared to God and his wisdom, they're foolish. And so that kind of leads into the point, and that is that, when you think about the smartest person in the world, a lot of times people, and I'm not saying us in a room, but people will say, oh, well, that's a smart person. And since it's a smart person, they obviously know what they're talking about. And so I can obviously just simply believe what they say or what their opinion is. But at the same time, the smartest person in the world can be wrong. Right? And there are times that the dumbest person in the world can be right. And so, the dumbest person in the world can be wiser than the smartest person in the world, who depending on what it is, can be foolish. And so we don't necessarily need to think, oh, well, since this person is smart, or this person is academic, or this person is whatever, therefore they are automatically right. Sometimes we need to just simply stop and think about things, and maybe even just use some common sense, because I've come across some people who are awfully smart, and they say some things that really don't have any bearing in common sense whatsoever. And it's kind of like, well, okay, that's fine, but I think I'm going to go another way. And, I'm kind of glad that I did. Question number 2 here. Do scientists agree on the origins of mankind? No, they do not. Okay? Even scientists that are in the camp of the theory of evolution, they still don't agree with one another. Okay? They still debate with one another. So why is it that oftentimes we only hear one side? What do you think?
Gain control of the media, and you can do things like that.
Well, that is true, but in more than just simply the media, in academia and everything else. I think that oftentimes the side that we hear as far as evolution goes, I think that there is a deeper principle there, and that is that, I do believe that God exists, and if God exists, I do believe that Satan exists. And if Satan exists, I do believe that there is deception out in the world, and that Satan oftentimes controls the narrative. And so, Ben, so many times we say it's the media, or it's this and that, but when you dig deeper, there's an underlying current there that oftentimes guides and directs what our discourse is in society, what people think, what people feel, the way that people view things. And, it's no different with this. And so oftentimes when we think, well, okay, if there's another side, obviously we would be hearing about it. Well, not necessarily if it's something that Satan can use for his own ends and objectives. But we got to understand that there really is another side to the story. Okay? All right. So what we're going to be looking at tonight are these points. Like I said, we're talking about the evidence of God's existence, and that evidence being we ourselves, us. Now, as far as this goes, I want to bring up a couple of points to be disclaimers here. Number one disclaimer is that, like I said before, I'm not trying to prove God's existence, because you can't prove God's existence. The things that I'm going to present to you tonight, things that I presented to you last week, you can go online and you can find counter arguments to it. Okay? And you can say, oh, well, hey, Brother Steve, he's not a scientist. He's not pretending to be a scientist. He even claims he's not a scientist. And yet, here's this other guy who is a scientist. He knows, I'm going to believe him over that. No, I'm not trying to prove anything. This isn't a debate, right? I'm just simply saying, okay, since God exists, there's evidence of existence, and here's some things for us to think about and things for us to consider. Number one. Number two is that I do not believe in evolution. Okay? Tonight I'm going to be presenting things in more of a hypothetical argument, and in that hypothetical argument, there may be some things, it's like, okay, if evolution were the case, then what about this? And so, you may be listening to it, somebody may be listening to it, not knowing me, say, oh, well, he believes in evolution. No, that's actually going to be in part 2. This is part 1. That's going to be in part 2. And so, I just want to kind of get that right off the bat and say, if somehow some of the things that I'm implying is an implication that evolution is right, that is not supposed to be the case. That's just simply supposed to be for argument's sake. Does that make sense? Okay. Well, so since it's Bible study, let's open the Bible and take a look at a verse. Psalm 139, verse 114. Psalm 139, verse 113. By the way, how many of you have read and like Psalm 139? Oh, I like Psalm 139. This is one of my favorite psalms. And it just so happens we've got a verse in it tonight. So, Psalm 139 in verse number 14. It says this, I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. Okay? So, looking at the very first part of that verse. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. So, what does that tell us? It tells us that God's made us, right? And so since God has made us, then, we are not a product of evolution. It's not something that just simply came about by randomness and circumstance. God is in control and God has taken care of it. And like I said, if God has made us, then there is going to be evidence of a maker. When you're driving around town and, you come across a deck that is being built, and you look at that deck and you see that deck is made, then what do you think? You think Jake's been here, right? Jake's on the job. He's taking care of it. When you see something that's built, you see a maker, and you see somebody who's built it. You don't think that, a windstorm came along and knocked down the trees and, some beavers got a hold of it and chewed up into planks and then all of a sudden there was an earthquake and they all fell together into perfect form. You don't think that. When you see something that's designed and you see something that has organization and wisdom to it, you think that it was planned that way. You think that it was made that way. And when you look at this verse, how are we made? Not how are we made as far as how are we made, but I mean, in what is the adjectives that describe or adverbs that describe our making?
Fearfully and wonderfully.
Wonderful made.
Fearfully and wonderfully made. Okay? And so it's not as if, we come across a deck, and I'm not trying to put down Jake's decks by any means, because, we weren't made in Japan or China, right? Okay, so, we really were made very fearfully. Another translation for fearfully could be something that is awesome. It's not as if fearfully that causes us to be afraid. Excuse me. It's not something that causes us to be afraid. It's something that causes us to have a godly fear or an awe about us. And so I think I came across one translation where it said awesomely made. And so if you think about awesomely as far as, being full of awe, then that kind of makes sense. And wonderfully made is that, the human body really is full of wonders. If we think that we have got the human body all figured out, we don't. Have you ever gone to the doctor and, the doctor says, I think that, well, why doesn't he know that, right? I mean, he's a doctor, for crying out loud. He's studied medicine, and, you think that if he's getting paid that kind of salary, he would know it. Why doesn't he say that? Because he doesn't know. One thing that I remember when I went to a doctor, the doctor told me, he said, every body is different. Not everybody is different, even though that was the case. It was everybody is different. And it kind of stuck with me a little bit. You know, when you talk about the human body, you know, not everybody is alike. Not everybody is the same. You know, there's differences there, and there's such complexities there. And so, you know, if you think about the one who has created all of that, one who has made all of that, that really is something. Okay. Comments or thoughts about that before we move on? Okay. Then second point right here. A couple of things that we need to understand about evolution that are very obvious but don't really come across as being obvious to people, but I think that it's necessary for us to think about. And that is that, first of all, we need to understand that evolution does not prove the non-existence of God. Okay? How many times when you talk to somebody who's an atheist and they say, there is no God because we have evolved and evolution exists, right? Okay? And a lot of times I think that people will say, oh, well, that's a pretty serious argument, you know, to say that, well, because we've got evolution there, then, you know, there really can't be any room for God. But wait a minute, why not? I mean, just because evolution is there, or the theory of evolution is there, assuming that the theory of evolution is true, that doesn't disprove the existence of God, does it? You know, if somebody could come up and say, you know, we've uncovered every rock, nook, cranny, corner in the universe, and we do not see any sight, sound, or hair of God. He is not there. We have proved God doesn't exist. Right?
That's what the cosmonaut said when he got into space.
Well, there's a lot more space than where he went to. But the point is that doesn't mean anything because God is outside of space. God's outside of time. God's outside of matter. He is spirit. And so, you know, if we were to search every nook and cranny in this universe, it doesn't mean that God isn't outside of the universe, right? And so if somebody comes up and says, okay, the theory of evolution is true, it shows us where we have come from, so therefore there is no God, that doesn't prove anything, right? Because, and like I said, we're just argument's sake, if the theory of evolution is true, all it means is that we did not come from what Genesis 1:1 says. But it doesn't disprove the existence of God. So one thing that we got to think about is that when we're thinking about evolution, and, you know, if we're ever talking to somebody about the Lord, you know, if they come up and they say, oh, well, God doesn't exist because evolution is true, you know right off the bat, that's really not logically right, okay? You know, you got to think about it in a different light. And here is something else, and that is that, that evolution does not account for how life began. Okay, so the theory of evolution is that you've got a single cell organism that goes and starts to divide into multiple cell organisms. And then that multiple cell organisms start to go and reproduce. And so then you start to have these other organisms that start to adapt, and as they start to adapt, they start to evolve, and they start to evolve into more complex things until we have what we have today, right? Okay. Now, that does not ever say how it happened, does it? You know, back in the 1950s, the theory was that there was going to be some sort of primordial mud, and that the existence existed exactly right, and that lightning struck it, and as lightning struck it, there was a spark of life that was emitted to it, and that those chemicals in the mud became the first organism, and then that first organism started to become alive and started all of this process off. Well, guess what? scientists went to start to shock all kinds of different forms of mud with all kinds of different chemicals and all kinds of different environments. And guess what? They never could replicate life. Never could do it. Okay? And so they pretty much started to say, okay, well, there's other theories there. There's other theories of it started in deep sea vents. There's other theories that it started on the backs of crystals and crystals organized proteins. There's even one theory that life came from a different planet. You know, a meteor came from another world and carried bacteria and struck our Earth, and then that's where life began. Which is, if you stop and think about it, it's kind of like, well, wait a minute, how could that bacteria, number one, survive out there in space on an asteroid, and then number two, survive an impact strike with the Earth? Okay. The point that I'm making is this: no scientist can say with any absolute certainty, this is how life began. Okay? And if you don't have that, then you really don't have evolution after all. Do you? You know? Even if that theory of evolution is all true, it's kind of like, well, wait a minute. How did it all start to begin with? Right? Okay. So next point that we're going to talk about is this right here, and that is complexity from a biological standpoint points to design and not a product of natural selection. So as far as Darwin goes, Darwin was thinking, okay, all of these organisms, they're going to just naturally evolve and naturally adapt. And given the magic formula of time, then all of these things are going to gradually evolve and jump species and then start to become what we've got now. But what we need to understand that, the very start of it all, where they say it's going to happen, the reason why they can't prove it is because it's far more complex than what they imagined it would be. To Darwin, his idea of a cell was pretty much that, right? You got a cell membrane, you've got the nucleus, and then you've got all the fluid inside, And when I was, in high school, biology, that's what a cell was. Well, a cell is much, much more intricate and much, much more complex than whatever, I thought of when I was a teenager, whatever Darwin thought of when he was a scientist. And the complexity of a cell, especially the complexity of a cell that is going to be alive and start to reproduce, is so amazingly complex. Now, I'm venturing into areas that I really don't have a lot of expertise about. So if you have questions about this, you're going to have to go consult Mr. Google, not me, because I don't really know a whole lot of the answers. But what scientists say is that, as far as the cell goes, you have to have proteins in there for it to work. And you have to have a bare minimum of about 250 proteins in order for a cell to be alive. Okay? So these proteins are going to have strings and be created with strings of amino acids. And there's going to be hundreds of strings of amino acid involved in one protein. Now, there's 4 different kinds or 4 different types of programming involved with these proteins. And the thing is that a string of amino acid has to be lined up exactly in the right order in order for that string to be functioning. Okay? So if you think about it here, you got a cell, and in that cell, you've got to have a protein. In fact, you've got to have 250 of those proteins. And then you've got to have amino acids, hundreds of them, lined up in order for it to work. Okay? Now, this line of amino acid, it's got to be, right in the right spot. It's got to be right in the right function. It's got to be all there. And again, you got to have 250 of them in order for it to even be the bare minimum for it to work. Now, let me ask you something. What is the chance that that just simply happens randomly? You know, there's some people that are going to say that it is, let's see, 1 in 10 to the 40,000th power for it to happen randomly. Okay? Now, again, you're going to go to other websites, you know, there's going to be other arguments. They're going to say, no, that's not right. This is, you know, there's going to be arguments. But the point that I'm wanting to just simply make is this, that when you think about a cell, don't think about it as far as something really simple that, you know, it's a bunch of chemicals that lightning strikes it and magically comes alive and then starts to replicate and then off goes life. I mean, it's not that simple. It's something that's incredibly complex. It is something that is incredibly delicate. It's something that's incredibly, needs incredible accuracy to it. And so if you think about seeing something that requires that accuracy and requires that precision and requires that complexity, what would you naturally think? Would you naturally think, oh, this is something that happened randomly, or this is something that happened by design? Now again, let's assume that the theory of evolution is correct, okay? What we're talking about is that start of life that cannot be duplicated in a lab. And so it's not like scientists say, hey, we've got proof that this is how life began. They really don't know how life began. And so if you're talking about a God that is beyond this universe, why can't that God have started it? Right? Okay. Well, it goes on from there. And that is, when you think about that little cell that's there, think about what that cell is going to be required to do as far as to produce life. That cell is going to have to be able to replicate itself. That cell is going to have to be able to heal itself. And that cell is going to have to be adapting. And all of that is done just simply by natural circumstance? I don't know about that. Something else. What if you were to have a robot? Okay? This robot is going to be able to self-fuel itself. Anyway, it's going to go and get its own fuel. It doesn't have to be refueled by somebody else. It's going to do it, you know, seek out its own fuel source, and it's going to fuel itself. That would be pretty incredible right there, right? Okay, but beyond that, this robot is going to be able to self-diagnose its own problems and fix itself. And this robot is going to be able to go and build other robots that are the same as it. Okay? This robot is going to be able to lift hundreds of times its own weight. This robot is going to be able to network with hundreds of other robots to perform complex functions and operate in a complex society. Okay? Now, here's the thing. That robot is 1/8 of an inch long. That would be an incredible robot, wouldn't it? That's an ant, and we step on them every day and we don't care. Okay? So what I'm saying is that when you think about life here on this earth are far greater than what we've got going on. As humans, and of course I'm just describing ants, but as humans, we have traits that are unique from animals and really are incompatible with a concept of natural selection. For example, this. Have you ever thought that as far as humans, one thing that makes us very unique is that we are self-aware? We're self-cognitive. We have transcendental awareness. In other words, we think about thinking. Have you ever thought about that? I mean, as far as you yourself, have you ever just had moments where you sit down and you go, you know, I'm here, right? I'm aware of what's going on. I have purpose. I have a meaning. I have a reason for existence. Now stop and think about this for a moment, since we're talking about thinking. You know, if we're just simply talking about, you know, the evolutionary process of organisms, how in the world can that come into being and come into focus? And here's something else. It is universally present. It has been here for millennia. It spans continents, it spans cultures, it spans races. It is, I won't say in every single human being, but it is in most human beings, isn't it? As a matter of fact, it's into the point where we look at our children and we say, hey, that child has meaning, that child has importance, and that child has purpose, right? How in the world would we have ever gotten there from natural selection? Because with the idea about natural selection is that you're here by accident, and once you are gone, you're gone. What purpose do you really have in the idea about natural selection? So that somehow in the grandest scheme of billions of years, that life is forming and evolving, even though the sun is going to gobble it up and it's going to be gone anyway? Right? You know, how could you possibly have this idea about not only an awareness of around you and what's going on, but to think I've got a meaning, I've got a purpose, and I've got a grander scale? Okay? Something else, and that is, what about morality? Now stop and think about this for a second. As far as morality goes, have you ever stopped to think that pretty much humans around the globe, down throughout the millennia, down throughout the centuries, have had the same basic set of moral standards? Olga is from Russia. Olga, is it wrong in Russia to murder
Right.
and to steal
Yes.
and to lie?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. You know, you think about it. If people and if you were able to evolve, you know, and people are going to say, oh, well, these morals that we have are just simply something that has developed over time in order for, you know, societal cohesion. You know, so that communities and humans can survive. But we're talking about all over the place, you know, and we're talking about people back, you know, 2,000, 3,000 years. Same difference, right? And some of those morals that are there are really things that are going to be incompatible with the idea of survival of the fittest, right? Okay, what about adultery? What about premarital sex? When you look at cultures and you look at history, pretty much that has been taboo. But if you stop and think about it, in an idea of a society where, you know, it's the survival of the fittest. It's the idea of, you know, surviving at all costs, propagation of the species. Adultery and premarital sex kind of run against that, don't you think? So why is it and how is it that we would have ever evolved that kind of behavior? And not only that, but what about kindness? You know, we've got kindness, and kindness is generally speaking of a global thought, but yet at the same time, nice guys finish last, don't they? Okay. Now, of course, you're going to say, well, not everybody in the world is kind, and that's another thing, is that globally, universally, we've got these set of standards, and globally, universally, we break them. Okay? When you think about it, if these are just simply traits that would have evolved to keep our species alive, then you would think that the traits to break them would have fallen by the wayside, right? But it's not. We've got the universality of sin as well as the universality of good and being moral too. Have you ever thought about that? That's something that kind of makes me kind of scratch my head and go, huh, how about that? How about this? We as humans we have the ability to look into the future and see hope. Right? You think about that in terms of survival of the fittest, in terms of natural selection. How in the world is that even possible, right? You know, if there is nothing out there, if there's no reason to hope, then why do we do that? You know, when you think about just simply the idea of people, when their backs are up against the wall, they still will have a tendency to hope for the better and hope for the future, right? By the way, pessimist going to see that the glass is half empty. An optimist is going to see that the glass is half full. A realist is going to look at it and say, hey, there's more water, or the glass is twice as high as what the water is. Okay. Anyway, something else about hope. And by the way, you know, you look at any animals, what animal is going to be looking into the future and seeing hope? Okay. Something else, and that is in Ecclesiastes, it talks about how eternity is bound up in the heart of man. And so when you think about hope, then we've got this idea about a future hope, an eternal hope as well. You take a look at societies, no matter where they are, you look at societies, even ancient societies, guess what? They've got an idea about a life after death. Now, I've thought about this, and it kind of makes sense, and that is, imagine yourself being a caveman somewhere, right? And a person of your clan has just died. What would be the natural thing to do? They're dead, let's bury them and move on. Where in the world would somebody come up with the idea of, hey, there's something else in that body that has gone and moved on to a different place? And that thing, of course, we have seen everything in our life die, whether it's an animal, whether it's a tree, any living thing we know dies, but yet somehow that thing that we can't see in that person is living forever. Now, I can see that as far as a person's imagination goes, they could come up with that idea, right? And they could even tell some other people about it, and some other people would say, you know what, that brings me comfort right now, and I like that idea. But how about something that's going to be universal? Right? And even universal now. We've got different ideas about what heaven is, but generally speaking, universally, we've got a concept of heaven. Now, did that come about by some sort of natural selection, or did that come about because God has created us and have some sort of conscience and awareness to where we have eternity bound up in our hearts? Again, it's not proof, but we're looking at evidence. We're either going to take the evidence, we're going to say we're going to believe it or we're going to disbelieve it, right? And here's something else, and that is that generally, universally, globally, down throughout the ages, historically, people had some sort of belief in God or gods. There was theism that was there, okay? Atheism was kind of being a relatively new thing on the block. Again, you could say, well, it's because of this particular religion or it's because of that particular group. But then again, you're talking about quite different concepts of what God is. You're talking about different religious systems. You've got different ideas, but it is throughout human history and it is throughout different cultures that we've got a belief in God. We've got morality there. We've got eternity that's there. We've got hope that's there. We've got, and we haven't even scratched the surface as far as our appreciation of beauty. We haven't even scratched the surface as far as the ability to create or the ability to dream, the ability to imagine things, the ability to have language. I mean, language in and of itself is an incredible thing that no other animal on this earth can even replicate. you know? And I know that they can talk and communicate with each other, but not like we can. We not only can communicate with each other as far as with sounds go, but we can even communicate with each other through nonverbal communication. And we even can communicate with each other by saying one thing, but meaning another thing, and the other person knows the meaning of the thing that we're not saying.
I think some of the strong truth that God is, Jesus in a class, and all the disciples saw Jesus, and the fact is that after he rose from the dead and appeared here on earth 40 days, 500 more people saw him as he rose from the dead. This proves that Jesus God manifested was that God did exist.
Paul, you're 4 weeks ahead of us.
4 weeks from now, we're not gonna have Bible study because, no, you are absolutely right. We're actually gonna get into that, about how the resurrection of Jesus is evidence of God. And so, but no, you are absolutely right about that. Let's take a look at some Bible questions real quick. Okay? Down the bottom.
Looking at Psalm 139 and verse 14, what we read just earlier, and reflecting on the complexity of the human body, does this cause you to be more or less in awe of God? It does, doesn't it? You know, if somebody says this does not cause me to be in more awe of God, then you're not seeing God as the creator. You know. Okay, moving on. Romans chapter 1. We have taken a look at some scriptures in Romans chapter 1. Let's move on and take a look at some of the other scriptures. What we have seen is that in verse number 19 of Romans chapter 1, that the things known about God is plain because of the creation, right? That was last week. But in verse number 21, it says, "For although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God, nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images made to look like mortal man and birds and animals and reptiles." Okay, so here's the question. That is, if complexity points to a creator, why is science so reluctant to shift gears? Do you think that what we just read kind of applies in this regard? Now, what we talked about just now was how is a reflection of the ancient Gentile world starting to look at the creation and create idols, okay? So this isn't prophetic or anything like that. That's what this is about. But do you see any similarities? And if so, what? Let me ask you something. Why do you think science is so reluctant to stop and think, hey, maybe there's a designer behind this, and maybe this is a creation instead of random circumstance? Okay. Okay. So there's a couple of different prides there. First of all, pride in their own work. And then secondly, a pride in terms of, oh, if we are wrong, then we have to stop and recognize somebody else. Okay.
I was thinking if there's a creator, you have to submit to their rules.
We don't have to, but you should.
Logically, if you acknowledge there's a creator, you have to acknowledge what they say is correct.
Do you think that in a certain regard, you can say that the creation has almost become a religion to some people? In terms of we look at it and we're so enamored with it that we don't see anything beyond it. You know, we're looking at natural selection and we're so enamored with the thought and the awe of how these, you know, complicated things can come from such simple things that becomes something that just occupies people's minds. And it becomes more of, well, we have to do this because it's right, it's true. And in that regard, and I'm not saying a religion in terms of like bowing down, worshiping, or anything like that, but to have an ideology about it that would take adherence to it, just like a religion would. I think that there is that out there. Not every case, but I think that there is that out there. All right. Anybody have any last minute questions or comments before we leave off from this?
Yeah, I used to give out this one track, Jackie checked the other one, creator or liar, and it tells you that you got a choice to make. Did who he created or his liar. But the Bible says, let God's word be true, every man a liar.
Yep.
So if you want to believe that the creator, then of course that man's a liar.
Yeah. And
We're going to kind of go in that direction next week, part 2. So next week we're going to talk, not at length about evolution. Well, yeah, maybe more at length about evolution, but more in terms of what creation is. And talk about why it's so very important for Bible-believing Christians to understand and know what creationism is about. So, Carol, did you have something?
It's probably gonna be next week that you're talking about.
Well,
I'm just thinking about, like, if we evolved from whatever, why have we're stuck in the same kind of a body that we've been in? We haven't gone into something else.
Yeah,
that's a very good point.
As far as what we've got now, evidence of God, we are creating the likeness and image of God, and so that's the reason why we've got the form that we've got now. It's kind of like, okay, if we were to be evolving, why don't we grow wings? I mean, it sure would help with rush hour traffic, wouldn't it? I think. So, I guess that's why, people are out there trying to develop drones that we can fly around in. Oh no, that's another thing about people. We always find something to complain about.
I thought that the fact that people are symmetrical points to a higher power than someone who's designed us.
Sure.
That's just what I've always thought, like studying the human body, like the symmetrical aspect of it, and even like animals too. Like specifically people, like 2 eyes, a nose in the middle, because like it kind of goes along more. So like there's functionality behind it, but also like just with the face, like like faces are beautiful, and it's something to sometimes like admire and look at. Like that's a nice face,
Right.
It's like there's no reason for that besides God wanting it to be that way.
Well,
Exactly.
That's what I'm saying, that there's something that I just barely mentioned. That is the idea about aesthetics. We appreciate beauty, right? And we know even people who are not necessarily all that design oriented, but we know beauty when we see it, right? And you're right. I mean, why would one animal look at another animal and say, you're beautiful? But we do, and we can see art and we can see beauty in other people. We can see art and we can see beauty in animals. And, I don't think that, Spot walking down the road with his owner is looking over there at, the bird in the bush and going, well, that sure is a beautiful little bird. I want to eat it. That's all they think. Just let me have it. Okay. Anybody else?